Good morning and a very warm welcome to you all to our first electrical vehicle webinar. This event is part of an EV series that G&T has been running, including 4 thought leadership articles on the G&T Market Intelligence microsite, and there'll be further webinars to come, but more about that later. I am Mark Gledhill and I will be your host, moderator and chair for this morning's session with you. To start our session, let's recap. The UK took a historic step on the road to ending its contribution to climate change when the government announced on the 18th of November 2020 the end of the sale of new petrol and diesel cars in the UK by 2030. This will put the UK on course to be the fastest G7 country to decarbonise cars and vans. Between 2030 and 2035, new cars and vans can be sold if they have the capability to drive a significant distance with zero emissions, but all new cars from 2035 will no longer have internal combustion engines. Although not the only route to achieving the government's target, electric vehicles has emerged as one of the leading contenders on the road to zero. G&T has had extensive experience in 3 key areas in which work is being done to help meet the critical challenges of EV uptake, including infrastructure development and delivery, facilities for R&D and manufacture, and facilities for product placement and brand experience. But fundamental to increasing the uptake of EVs is ensuring that there is adequate charging infrastructure installed throughout the UK. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Although the expansion of charging infrastructure has been fast, the infrastructure rollout curve is well behind the government's planned curve of EV uptake. EV infrastructure needs to grow rapidly to help the UK government meet its ambitious carbon emissions targets. Today, we have gathered a panel of experts who will, over the next hour, share their thoughts on how the UK can meet this pressing challenge. We have Jean-Pascal Boutin, who is Head of Energy Regulation at Eversheds, or JP, as I'll be calling you for the next hour. Alex Gilbert is Head of Energy and Electrification at TfL. Steve Holmes, Head of EV at Clarke EV, and Jason Fowler, Partner at G&T of our Infrastructure and Transport Group. Good morning to you, gentlemen. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions. Please use the function at the bottom of the screen to raise these as the webinar progresses. We've also had some questions sent in ahead of today. Should we run out of time to answer all the questions, we will respond to you by email or phone after the close of the webinar. In addition, a recording of today's session will be sent out to all attendees, so there's no need to make any notes. Finally, all speakers are presenting from home, so please bear with us should we experience any IT difficulties. Okay, so to start things off this morning, I'm going to start by asking each of our speakers to introduce themselves and give you a brief overview of their role and organisation. JP, please may I start with you?
Mark, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to participate in the webinar today. As Mark said, my name is Jean-Pascal Boutin. I'm a partner at Eversheds Sutherland in their energy group. If you don't know Eversheds Sutherland, we're an international global law firm with almost 2,500 lawyers worldwide. And in the UK, we have 10 offices spread out across the UK. We've advised on over 50 gigawatts of renewable energy projects and battery projects around the world. And just looking at the EV space, most of our work currently is involved in advising on public sector concessions. So this is the public sector rolling out EV charging points across their sites. We're also seeing an increasing number of private sector landlords looking at how to make their sites more attractive for their tenants and the rollout of EV charging points across all their sites, looking at different structures and also unpicking the property documentation to accommodate these charging points. And lastly, we're also advising a lot of charging point operators on the rollout of charging points, including tendering for framework agreements and the licensing issues. That was just a brief overview of what we're doing in the market on the EV space.
Thank you, JP. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Mark, and good to see everyone here today. Really well attended, especially for the time of morning. So absolutely a fantastic turnout so far. So Alex Gilbert, background in green finance and sort of clean tech investment over the years. A lot of focus on that, on e-mobility. I now do some early stage work, also work for government sort of around e-mobility and the broader smart cities piece. And then a lot of my time spent at TfL, where I head up the energy and electrification within the function of TfL called commercial development. TfL probably doesn't need a huge amount of introduction, but Transport for London, the world's largest integrated transport body, and hopefully what will be integrated in every possible way. So we're the most active home builder. Now in London, we have a role to play, obviously, in creating the world's first great smart, sustainable city, and there's sort of all hands on deck to try and affect that huge challenge. Within that, what we try to build is a serious focus on EV charging and the provision of that infrastructure. So as most on the call will know, there's all ranges of charging, and today I suppose my focus mostly is around rapid charging, so larger, higher speed hubs for delivery, and that's what we've done a huge amount of work on. Going back to our work with Element Energy in mapping demand and supply in London. So very keen to speak about that and share some of the thoughts and the learnings that we've had with you all today. So delighted to be here.
Great, thank you, Alex. And Steve, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Holmes. I'm Head of EV at Clarke EV. Very happy to be here and support the event. Looking forward to hear all the comments from the co-panelists as well. Clarke EV, we're a full turnkey provider of EV charging solutions to both business and also public sector nationwide across the UK, including Northern Ireland. We're part of Renew Holdings PLC, a holdings company with a number of companies within it, all focusing on national critical infrastructure. So we address rail, transportation, highways, nuclear, land management, telecoms, and EV as a national telecoms, as a national infrastructure initiative as well. We have approximately 350 staff in the business across the country, a third of which are in the field. So these are engineers actually out doing surveys, doing installation works. And we have 2/3 of our organization in the back office, ranging from our corporate shared services, our designers, and our support staff. We've been working for approximately 20 years in the telecommunications and EV business, serving the likes of EE, Vodafone, and the other main mobile operators here in the UK. Our capabilities are comprehensive and broad. From an EV perspective, of course, we have the core capabilities of design, electrical installation, civils work, and operations and maintenance. But unlike many other in this space, we also have our ICP capability, which allows us to work on behalf of the client in terms of liaison with and delivery of external power, which sometimes for an EV installation can be one of the unknown and unforeseen expenditures, and also can add potentially some significant delay. So we provide that service. And something else that we also provide is that we have a team of approximately 30 people looking after third parties, so working with landowners, landlords, so working with way leaves, consents, and so on and so forth. Again, something which, if unplanned, can delay the rollout of EV. We're accredited by OZEV, the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, and that allows us to work with our clients and on their behalf draw down and have access to grant funding to offset the cost of the deployment of infrastructure. Whilst we work with some of the key hardware and software manufacturers globally here in the UK, we also remain product and manufacturer agnostic. Therefore, we can offer impartial and objective advice and guide a customer to an EV solution that is suitable and appropriate for their needs. And we adopt a sort of, let's call it a consultative approach. We recognize that customers will be dipping their toe in the water in EV in the first instance. So working with our customers over the life cycle of EV as their fleets evolve to electrified vehicles, we will work with our customers over the longer term and provide that guidance and counsel throughout the process. So pleased to be here and looking forward to the event.
Great, thank you, Steve. And Jason, over to you. Oh, just take yourself off mute, Jason.
Sorry, there you go. First mistake, pound in the pot. Morning, everyone. My name is Jason Fowler. I'm a partner at Gardner and Theobald in our major projects and programs team. And like the others, really delighted to be part of this panel to discuss this important subject this morning. Our part of Gardner and Theobald have clients across the infrastructure and transportation sectors, certainly in aviation, highways, rail and utilities, and provide services centred on our core capability in cost, commercial and project management, but including the development of business cases for our clients, supplier market management, procurement, and assurance services. And I think interestingly, Gardner and Theobald bring a good combination of work across the public and private sector and across the property and infrastructure sectors. And I think where we bring something unique is our knowledge of how those worlds come together and may need to come together to formulate the infrastructure for electric vehicles going forward. Clearly, environmental issues and the road to zero are core to what we're going to be focused on over the next 10 years. And it seems to me that the whole EV arena is a very direct way for people to contribute. It's certainly an area where we find huge enthusiasm in our teams and very many transferable skills, as I've touched upon. We, as a specialist organisation, naturally want to collaborate, as we do in other arenas, to drive sustainable value for our clients. And it's great to see so many clients and supply chain colleagues in the audience today. And I very much hope to sort of connect with you to continue the debate beyond the session this morning. So looking forward to the debate, and I'll let you move us on, Mark.
Great, thank you very much, Jason. And as you say, let's get into it. So, first question. What are the main challenges in the delivery of EV infrastructure? That's what we want to know. So, Alex, I'm going to head to you first, if that's okay. What are the main obstacles or challenges that you are currently facing in the rollout of EV infrastructure across London with your role in TfL?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. It's I'd say some of these I'll touch on are probably London specific, but frankly, if it's not obvious, TfL does have an interest nationwide. We certainly hope to take the learnings of what we've done, some of basically the homework that we've done for this, and roll this out across the country and indeed quite possibly the world. The first and foremost, the challenge of London is, of course, you've got huge demand, higher than anywhere else, matched with probably the most limited supply. So immediately you're sort of taking a backward step as you have to look at that. And that's why we've done so much work to try and better understand exactly where the demand is and really get a grip on that. And then, of course, take a much more focused look at our supply. TfL has a huge amount of land. Many boroughs will have land. There'll be a lot of private holdings for land. But as anyone in the industry knows at the moment, there's certainly not nearly enough charging infrastructure in London to meet the demand that we all expect. So taking that on, you have to try and match as well as possible, try and free up that land, try and make those things available, and of course, make those internal business cases that you're able to do. We all know we are currently at the early stages of charging in this country. It's an incredibly exciting space, probably why so many people on the webinar, so many people are keen to learn, but it is early days. So at the moment, you've got to make that justification that we're going to see increased utilization, increased uptake of EV, etc., which I'm sure there's no one here doubts that will happen, but it's the timing of that. So the work that we've done mostly is to try and facilitate that, to try and allow EV charging to be taken as seriously as any other model, and indeed to operate with other models. So I'm looking at a lot of EV charging hubs now with residential above, combined with retail and commercial, as multimodal hubs, integrated with bus garages, all of these things that allow you to make that business case and allow you to build the infrastructure.
Thank you, Alex. And I guess, Steve, let's hear your view on this in terms of the commercial sector. What are the main challenges that you are currently facing in rolling out EV across all of your projects?
I think it was going to encapsulate it in one phrase. It would be education and awareness, I think, Mark. What we're finding is organisations have, and arguably as a result of COVID and the sort of debate that's been happening at the environmental level and the focus on EVs, as we can all see on our daily lives, EVs are now becoming part of the mainstream news these days, especially in the business news, whether it's the lack of or the investment into. So I think education awareness is something that we see as something which needs to catch up, and is something which clients and customers are looking for. most customers, as I've mentioned before, are dipping their toe in the water. They may have a couple of vehicles that they're transitioning to electric vehicles on their fleet. They may have employees, they may have management, they may have customers and visitors who are inquiring about availability of EV charging. So some of the questions that that we hear sort of time and time again is sort of, well, where do I start in this process of planning a deployment? What are my options? Who do I talk to? What do I need to consider in terms of investment, technology, service, and all really, really valid questions. Not least, what's going to cost me and what benefits am I going to get? Now, there's a lot of material out there, and Dr. Google is a good source for some of the insight. But events like this are really valuable, from my perspective, because it gives people some guidance and direction, and it gives people a network to talk to, which I think is important also. So I think what we've done at Clarke EV to help that consultation, to help that discussion, is we've developed what we call the 6-pillar approach, which is the 6 themes and 6 areas of consideration that we would always recommend a customer starts to focus on. And we're there to help in that process as well. But I think just to talk quickly through those 6, the first and foremost, a customer needs to have a general understanding of the scope of their EV, whether it's in terms of vehicles or charging requirements. That would typically be sort of, what sort of budget do I have available? Because many customers will say, look, I have a budget. What can I do for the budget? Because we want to put our toe in the water, or we've got so many vehicles on our fleet, not quite sure what our strategy is moving forward, but I've got a general idea of the type of vehicles, the number of vehicles, and the sort of timeline that we're working to. And that's a good starting position. But from then we need to sort of move on to pillar number 2, which is, okay, now we've got a general understanding of what the services that you'll be looking, whether it's at home, whether it's en route, whether it's at the offices, is, well, what are the external factors that I need to be thinking about now? And I touched on them briefly earlier, and there are 2 main external areas, one of which is asking for consent. So typically within a business environment, an office environment, you're typically dealing with landlords and superior landlords. So it's always important to engage early, to provide a general scope of what you're trying to achieve, and make sure there are no blockages and barriers that come down the line. Let's deal with them head on. And as I mentioned also before, one of the long lead times can be, if you're deploying a significant number of chargers, is the additional power supply into an area. Typically, you'd have to work with one of the electricity providers, the DNOs, and that's something that we would advise people to start to consider and engage on early doors. So once you've got a general idea of sort of what you're looking for in terms of scope, you then need to be looking forward into the future. So, okay, so what does my fleet look like in 2, 5, 10 years time? And even though it may be quite vague, it's important because it gives us an idea of what type of charging you may be looking for, making sure that if we're putting a solution in for day one, that it's future-proofed in terms of enablement works, or just trying to understand future lifetime costs so you can feed that into your business case. The 4th pillar would be around really start to get under the skin now in a level of detail around the demand. So if you're a logistics and fleet company, what are your telematics telling you in terms of routes, destinations, dwell times? Also looking carefully at the type of vehicles you have, because not all vehicles can charge at the same rate. Not all vehicles have got the same range, as we all know. So it's how do you actually bring that into the equation of planning your EV infrastructure? And then as you move forward into the last 2 pillars, you then start to look at, well, what's the commercial options I've got? What commercial models are available to me? Am I looking at this as an investment where I'll look to sink CapEx into it and purchase a solution and run it for me and my own staff and my customers and my suppliers? Or do I want to look for a model where I can spread the investment cost over a period of time? And yes, there are finance options out there, but there are also, subscription models are coming to the fore. Manufacturers, operators are starting to think, well, can I provide this charging as a service? We have infrastructure as a service in the telecoms world. Well, maybe EV as a service is a model moving forward. And then last but not least, you then have the CPO commercial offer. So this is, there are a variety of charge point operators that exist out there. And they're always, good to talk to. The issue and challenge you'll find with them is that typically they'll be looking for a payback in excess of 10 years to get a payback on that investment. And unless there's a throughput and a predictability of utilization of those charges, it may be difficult to attract that type of investment. And then last but not least, the 6th pillar is about trying to identify partners to work with, not just today, but into the longer term. of course, I would like to suggest that Clarke EV are there, but there's also, we mentioned Eversheds, there are other organisations that can help there, because it isn't just a case of focusing on EV today. It's looking at sustainability and the wider footprint. So EV, to me, is just one part of a sustainable energy solution. Where does solar come into it? Where does battery charging come into it? And so on and so forth. So they're the 6 pillars, and they're the sort of things that I would recommend as, with regards an engagement with your client to help and address that sort of education and awareness issue.
Great, Steve. Thank you very much. And I guess, having listened to both Alex and Steve, JP, how do you sort of, from your perspective as head of energy and regulation at EV, what are the challenges that you find, having listened to both of those points?
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. I mean, the challenges we see are very much from the point of view of our clients in the different projects we're advising. So I think as Steve touched on with the charging point operator, there it's very much a long-term play. Their financial model and the return is very much linked on when will EV take off and the attractiveness of the sites they're looking at. Whereas you look at the private landlord there, the big question is, do they take the plunge themselves? Do they invest the money themselves? Or do they outsource that to a charging point operator? And then the public sector, they're very much keen, they're looking at, well, how do I incentivize charging point operators to locate charging points in remote areas? There's the Road to Zero strategy of wanting charging points every 20 miles, in Wales 25 miles. So it's how do you incentivize charging point operators to go in remote areas? And again, as Steve mentioned, there's this funny grid availability issue. How, there's rapid charging points being installed all over the country. How do you reinforce the grid? Do you install batteries, etc.? And then last but not least, probably the most important, is the customer point of view. Where's the data on the nearest charging point, and what's the ease of access and reliability of that charging point? So I think these are all the challenges we're facing at the moment, but they are being overcome. People are moving forward, which is good news.
Thanks, JP. And I guess, just having listened to those, or each of your particular views, is it between private and public? Are there competing requirements, or are you both complementary to each other? Do you find that because of the demand for the extent of the EV rollout, you find yourself competing, or are you working in parallel with each other?
My point of view, I think that they are very complementary, and they must coexist. They have to coexist if we're going to provide that ubiquitous access to EV charging here across the UK. One thing I failed to mention earlier on is that whilst there are commercial challenges, there are also commercial opportunities. JP there mentioned, the private landlords and property owners. It's also a source of revenue income. EV should be and will be considered over time, I'm sure, as another utility package in with telecom, electricity, water and gas. So it's how do you commercialize that, whether you're a landlord for your tenants, whether you're a landlord for your business clients and business tenants. We're talking to retailers at the moment about, if you've got a car there which has 20-minute, 1-hour dwell time, why not use it to develop some brand loyalty, do some promotion, marketing? There's products coming out on the market now which are like kiosks, which provide an opportunity for digital marketing services. Also, retailers are looking at providing, energy charging as a loyalty scheme. And being hypothetical here, but if you're a Marks and Spencer's card holder, well, then you're going to discount on your charging whilst you rock up a Marks and Spencer charge point in an out of town retail store. So there's opportunities and challenges.
Mark, if I may just add something to that as well. I mean, obviously from a TfL perspective, I still strongly feel there is a view for the public sector in the broadest sense. I think in this country we're still a bit 1970s at times when we talk about private, public, and those borders or those boundaries were crossed a long time ago. But it's kind of set in the British way of thinking that something's either private or public, and it's kind of good or bad depending on your view. And clearly that's a long time ago, as exhibited by our energy system, which we sort of privatized by selling off to lots of other nationalized organizations. So I think we've got to think a little bit deeper and with a bit more complexity to it. Clearly, as JP just noted, there's a lot of the country where frankly you have to have some public support. You know, it is simply not in a commercial interest to put charge points in still much of this country, and we really need to think about that. Otherwise, we're not going to have the sort of just transition that we need. But even in cities, you know, for me, where there's still a key role for a player in London, such as TfL, is this effectively the kind of guiding hand to try and give a bit of strategy, a bit of high level view, a bit of thinking time as to where charging needs to be for the benefit of all. And that isn't going to be in the interest of a private sector operator. That's not a criticism of them. It is simply the fact that they're going to grab any land that they can, and they're going to try and sell out in a few years whenever they can. We would all do the same if we were them. That's completely understandable, but that clearly isn't in the interest of the consumer. So we need to think about this. We haven't got what we had in petrol, where you have a few major providers and that's it. We could have many different providers. And as JP also just noted around the consumer, that, you know, that has to come first. This has to be consumer led, which means that when I'm turning up, I understand what the proposition is. I understand how to pay, how this thing all relates to me, this whole ecosystem. Touching on some of Steve's points, that broader sort of retail ecosystem as well. At the moment, a lot of consumers are confused. They don't understand what's going on, who the different providers are. They're probably looking at all our names and thinking, so what do you all do in this space? You know, it's a confusing new space, right? So we've got to make that easy, rather than sort of creating a wild west of hundreds of different operators all coming up with their own ideas. I think that's a key role there for the public sector.
Great, thank you, Alex. I guess let's just move this on a bit in terms of government support and direction, because I think this is quite interesting for us to sort of expand on. So, Jason, starting with you, how is the government supporting, and what schemes are in place to incentivise the installation of EV infrastructure, and what more could they be doing? Perhaps you could lead us off on that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in doing so, I might well also pick up on and respond to some of the points that were just made by other members of the panel. I think, you know, if we look back first, you know, successive previous governments have sort of set an expectation around the private sector to take the lead in the provision of charging infrastructure, assuming that the majority of recharging would likely take place in the home or at work. And on this basis, historically, they've seen a sort of publicly available charging network as probably being uneconomic and underutilized. Of course, fast forward to now, and in the last 3 to 4 years, as we were discussing earlier as a panel, there's been a very dynamic world, and there are now a number of government-backed funds that are launched to accelerate the rollout of charging infrastructure, recognizing that input was absolutely necessary. And the Office for Low Emission Vehicles has been set up by the Department for Transport and BEIS, with overall spending plans of in the order of £1.5 billion, which probably isn't enough, but there are substantive sums of money now being injected in effect to match fund private sector investment to accelerate the provision of these facilities. And I think it's a really interesting piece, because obviously the application for those funds is a reasonably complex landscape, and therefore, you know, there's support that can be given, and certainly we give that support to people sort of thinking about how to make the case for that input funding, so that the funds are proliferating. And more recently, the Rapid Charging Fund was established in the March 20 budget, aimed, as we understand it, at larger projects to deliver a rapid charging network ahead of demand across the country. And this might be looking toward the sort of more the HGV operators and others in terms of EV charging. And to then support that financial and funding input, there is now planning guidance and planning shift in order to encourage the provision of EV charging facilities, both in the home as individual charging facilities where all new homes with parking are required to provide that, and in sort of regional guidance such as the London Plan and the Edinburgh Design Guide, wherein, you know, there's obviously a push for the provision of these facilities. So that's all starting to come, and therefore there are financial and planning incentives in play. But the question I think then is to deliver what and where. And obviously local government authorities, as we've been saying, and the private sector have been leading the way, because there's no real sort of centralized approach to this. And there's a range of charge point providers who've incentivized by the finance that we've talked about to provide open access away from base charge point solutions that the other guys have been talking about, on street, residential, motorway, petrol station, as well as public and shopping centre car parks. So there's a great many sort of facilities springing up, supported by that funding and that planning guidance. But this sort of brings perhaps two challenges, I guess. The first we've talked about in terms of a level landscape, because obviously if left to the private sector, facilities will be developed in areas where they're economically most favourable, clearly. And we've got a lot of learning to take perhaps in the parallel with the initial rollout of broadband in the UK, where we've got colleagues in the fibre network market. And that's exactly what happened there, in the sense of it being rolled out to those areas where it was, you know, economically driven to. And there's a levelling up agenda now running to try and balance that and allow broadband access for all across the country. There's no doubt some learning that we can take from that sector into the EV arena and work out how to get there quicker this time around. And I think the other one that the government can focus on is interoperability, and the guys have mentioned that too, where you get a sort of what I would term a common user platform that is simple for the consumer and therefore is able to be adopted fairly quickly. I suppose one final point that I would make, and we haven't talked about it perhaps as much this morning yet, is sort of more at the macro level and the electricity network capacity question, where I think government could perhaps look at the regulatory structures that surround the network operators to sort of better enable the investments necessary to put the capacity where it's needed in the network. At the moment, they operate within quite fixed regulatory cycles of capital investment, and it's very difficult to deal with a really fast changing issue like EV within that structure. And therefore that's something I think that perhaps we ought to come back to in discussion and look at how government can support that arena in moving faster to allow us to pick up on EVs.
Thank you, Jason. Well, luckily we've got the head of regulation at Eversheds with us, so perhaps that's a nice segue, JP, into picking up some of the points that Jason has just been discussing. But from your view, what's your view on the approach to the regulatory policy to support the effective EV infrastructure? I know that's such a massive, broad question, but perhaps you could give us your view as to responding to some of those challenges in your view.
Yes, I mean, this is a challenge of any new scheme. I think the general approach of governments is to put the framework in place, minimal intervention, regulatory, restrictions, and as little funding as they can afford, and then let the market drive it forward. But I think what we're seeing is potentially, as time goes on, we're seeing some more funding coming into play, and there's a carrot and stick approach. We're seeing maybe a bit more of the stick as well. So, we're seeing on the cars, the phasing out of petrol and diesel cars that you mentioned. We're seeing more funding, but there's also a suggestion of more sticks, looking at landlords in terms of new build, forcing them to install charging points. And there's definitely, I think, as it's all a journey for everyone as people experience the charging points. I think there's definitely more regulation, and there's consultations ongoing at the moment in terms of the customer journey. So in terms of, just ensuring that the customer, principally in terms of ease of access for the customers. So I think I think the government's policy is developing in light of the take-up, and they're reacting to the take-up, which, is, you haven't got a crystal ball. On the last point, so Jason raised on the electricity side, on the capacity of the network and new connections, that is a very challenging issue. There are consultations going on in that respect, but I think it is a big challenge. I think there's almost bigger issues in that respect.
Thank you, JP. And Alex, can I just turn this point of regulation and the EV rollout, because I suspect that your challenge here is extremely difficult in terms of delivering that infrastructure across London's many different boroughs. I was going to say different, or should I say difficult political councils, but I think we'd be really interested to know how are you finding that coordinated approach with the central government initiative?
Yeah, it's a challenge. There's no doubt about that. I mean, for me, at a central to local level, central government to local government in this country, we're actually not too bad. Mostly, we all like to moan, and there's no direction here, and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, and all that. But actually, as has been noted, that there is a lot of support at the moment across this country. There's a almost sort of universal push for the electrification of transport and the charging that will support it. And there's very, very few that are now really seriously acting against that at any level. So I think that's okay. What you've still got, though, of course, as you touch on, is individual areas of the country, individual silos. And I touched on this earlier because this remains a challenge that you've got anywhere in the country. You've got the borough of this or the county of that or whatever, and right next door you've got someone else that says, that's ridiculous, Mark, I don't agree with what you're doing, we're going to do our own thing, have completely different provider. And of course the consumers that go between the two are just like, oh, well, am I still in that town, am I in it? We're back to those sort of the parking days many years ago. Do you remember when you sort of couldn't park in one borough? You'd have to think, which one am I in, because I need to pay differently. And and so again, here's a role for TfL. And I think all I would say, and this sounds a bit altruistic, but anyone that we're talking to at a local authority, ultimately, when you begin discussing what we're doing, we all want the same thing. So opening up that dialogue and saying, right, Mark, you're next door to us, but clearly we both want the best possible user experience. Why don't we think about this together? Why don't we scale this up, work together? It sounds all very Pollyannish, I know, but I think ultimately that's the only way you actually get anything, is people sort of sitting, talking, working together. So I'm trying to do a lot of that at the moment. And working with people and working with London councils, the organisation that represents the boroughs and the like, to say, let's think about something for the future of London here, for charging for London, and actually put that together. And obviously once you do that, you sort of pretty quickly work out we're all trying to get the same ultimate consumer experience. And I think that's the only way anything ever works, right, is all opening a dialogue and having that discussion. Yeah.
And I guess that open dialogue and discussion and the consumer-driven aspects of it, Steve, perhaps you could just lead us on into, well, how do you make it all commercially viable?
Well, we mentioned before about, and I'm talking specifically here around sort of workplace charging for businesses and public sector. But in that particular space, once you've truly understood what your budget needs to be and what your costs need to be, and what model you need to apply, whether it's a service, whether it's an investment of capex and the like, is that you need to really be trying to be able to monetize some of the investments in terms of benefits in return. At the end of the day, the business case needs to stack up. And whilst there are both political and environmental drivers behind this around the 2030 target and the 2035 target and the environmental objective that we're hopefully all embracing at the global level, it still needs to make financial sense. And yes, whilst there are government grants available, the government grants don't furnish the full cost of investment. So you need to monetize and realize some of those benefits. So if you're a fleet and logistics company, for example, the faster you move to an EV environment, of course, providing that the vehicles that you have the suitable capacity and support the journeys that you need to be making, there are real tangible benefits to be had. Mighty have recently put out a case study to say that, I think they've got however many 100,000 vehicles they've got across the country. They're realizing circa 35% operational savings in terms of running costs, maintenance costs. You don't have a combustion engine that goes wrong. You literally have an electric engine, electric motor and the brakes, and that's about it. You don't have gearboxes, you don't need for oil changes and all that type of good stuff. So there's benefits to be had there. Also, if you just look at general expenditure for running vehicles, whether it's company vehicles or fleet, your fuel costs are excessive. And even though you're moving from one fuel type to another, there are sufficient significant savings to be had there. So I think you need to be focused on realizing the commercial and financial benefits as a business and as a public sector, because at the end of the day, there needs to be a return on investment over a period of time. But also need to recognize that there are benefits, financial benefits also to employees as well. There are tax incentives with, battery only vehicles. Was it 1% benefit in kind at the moment, lifting up to 2% in a couple of years only. So how long those benefits will remain, I don't know. I would like to think, as indeed tends to be the way, that you'll get towards the brink of when these schemes are going to finish, and oh, surprise, surprise, we're going to continue it for another couple of years. But that at a government level, we're talking about government challenges before and government role. That's going to leave a significant gap in the tax receipts, in the road tax receipts. There's no road tax now on electric vehicles. So I think the last number was a 40 billion black hole in the tax receipts as a result of introducing EVs and the lack of taxation on petrol and diesel. So there's a whole variety of commercial drivers, both for government, public sector, and the individual. There are grants at the moment to offset the cost of electric vehicle. What was it, £3,000 and £8,000 for commercial vehicle? Now that still doesn't go all the way to actually alleviate that change of initial purchase price of a diesel petrol car versus an electric car. So that needs to be addressed as well. The OEMs have a role to play in that. Does government have a role to play? Possibly, but I think also there's a mind shift that needs to change. Electric vehicles only really sort of make sense when you look at it as a total cost of ownership. So you've got to offset the hike in purchase price with the benefits that come through, lower maintenance, lower costs, reduced tax or zero tax, road tax. So I think there's a whole variety of commercial considerations that I think as a society we're learning and we're trying to navigate through at the moment.
Great, thank you, Steve. I think that's interesting. You've raised a number of points there about the future of the EV market. And I think just to close out this part of the segment of the webinar before we try and answer some of the questions which have come through from our attendees this morning and before the session, is really to pick up on what is the most exciting thing about the UK EV market today, and is the UK well placed to be a world leader in EV? I think I'm certainly keen, and I'm sure everybody is also keen to understand our view from all the panelists based upon your area of expertise. Is what is the most exciting thing that is coming ahead? Perhaps Jason, do you want to lead us off on that question?
Yeah, sure, Mark. I mean, look, from the conversation that we've been having this morning, it's clear, isn't it, that it's a very dynamic arena and it's going to demand a great deal of innovation. And I think what's exciting is that the UK has a great track record in technological development and a very mature supply chain capable of strong collaboration to design great solutions and deliver great facilities. So I think, we've demonstrated that in a number of other sectors. I was looking up my stats in preparation for this. And if you look at aviation, UK-based supply chain in the aviation sector have worked in over 150 countries and been involved in the design and development of over 60 of the world's largest airports. When you think that's quite a huge testament to the sort of skill and capability that sits in the UK supply chain. So it's quite exciting to see us responding to this new challenge, isn't it? And the very many facets of it in delivering the infrastructure, the manufacturing and other things that we're going to come on to, I know, in future sessions. But I think the opportunity right in front of us is to take the technology we've already got and operationalize it in the right ways to provide the capability for EVs to be adopted very quickly. And we've also got, my final thought on that was that we've got COP26 in Scotland this year, haven't we? And what a great shop window for some of that capability that would enable our supply chain to then export this capability in the future to countries around the world.
Thank you, Jason. And JP, perhaps just coming on to your view as to the difficulties that the the sector and the market faces with the regulation perspective. What's the exciting part that's coming ahead for you?
I think we're just seeing a lot more momentum. If you look at again, it's from our clients' perception and feedback. We approach lots of clients, big retails, landlords, and property funds a number of years ago. This is both PV and EV charging points and battery, etc. And they're interested, but limited, I think, take up. And now we're really seeing it taking off. So everyone's looking, anyone definitely on the property landlords, they're all looking at their land and working out, how do I make the customer experience better? My tenants and big supermarkets, they're all looking at it. EV charging points, yes, definitely. How do we make this work? So it's definitely built up momentum. And I think just picking up also on Jason's point on innovation, I think we're now looking at the next step. We're looking at, and I think it's a question also raised by the audience, was, we've got EV charging points. Well, we need to coordinate that with the grid upgrades. We need to coordinate that with, those PV panels on next door's house. Can I access those PV panels? So it's linking everything together. We're very fragmented in this country, and it's linking up the DNO with the generators, with the consumers, even the private sector side, the households. It's having a more integrated system as well, which I think is very exciting, very interesting. And people are doing pilot schemes in this respect to try and work out that bigger picture.
Thank you, JP. And let's just hold that thought, because that is actually one of the questions that we've had before the session, I think, and also it's been raised this morning as well, which I wouldn't mind us having a 2-minute conversation on before we go. But just before we get there, Alex, just turning to you on the excitement, the key things coming ahead for you that are good.
I'll keep it very brief, because I definitely want to get onto that Q&A, and I'm sure that's what our attendees will want as well. So for me, just the fact that we're at the early stages of something incredible. We've got a load of brilliant people trying to work out an incredibly exciting but ultimately really positive problem to solve. Loads of people on it, and we're at the early stages, which means we can affect change in a way that we look back and moan about, the way electricity supply was set up, solar fits to this. That's done. We can't change that. But we can change this, and that's really great to be a part of.
Thank you, Alex. Steve?
Yeah, likewise, 30 seconds, conscious of time. Yeah, I think we're hitting a perfect storm, to be honest with you. People talk about the tipping point. I think this EV sector in the UK specifically is now at a tipping point. We've got societal change and acknowledgement about the importance of climate. We've got government policy and incentives coming to the fore. We've got strong economic activity with investment coming in from manufacturers and operators. Technology and software is improving dramatically all the time. And I think also at the macro level, just at a sort of, philosophical level, I think it's an opportunity to retrain and reskill the UK economy. So is it a good thing for the UK? Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so just like to say thank you to all the panel speakers for some really useful insights into the emerging EV market and the challenges of ensuring that we're adequately planning for the infrastructure to support that, the expansion. So it's now time to sort of answer some of the questions that we've been raised by our audience, and there have been quite a few. We've also had a number come through ahead of the webinar. So just to take 5 minutes or so, if we can step through those questions. And I think, Jason, we're going to start with you in answering the first one, if that's okay, which is what are the infrastructure and build program timelines, and what are the procurement frameworks and delivery strategies in place, which I think really sorts of out, I think also responds to one of Catherine's question as well, which she's raised this morning. So do you want to lead us off on that?
Okay, yeah, no, sure. I mean, look, I think there's a couple of key points that we've touched on already in our debate around the overall program for this, and I think it really is up at that electrical network level. there's two things to say, I suppose. One is, if you look into it, the importance of smart systems to help us avoid an impact on peak supply demand is key, isn't it? And I think those are going to have to be very carefully considered, because if we do raise the peak requirement, clearly we're into another level of cost and time and project planning in order to be able to bring through developments that provide that capacity. So that's a key point, and those smart systems necessary in order to manage when people charge their EV are going to be really critical. And I think what's interesting in that is that if you look at the average EV, as I read into it, takes the same electrical demand as the average household over a year. So, you know, it's a fairly significant hit on the system when you look at a residential area, that you know, that demand on the electrical network is key. So smart systems, avoiding an impact on the peak. I think the other piece that we've actually talked about is the difficulties in forecasting demand. And I think what's interesting about that is the dynamic of the market, the rate of uptake that we're likely to see with EVs that we're also excited about, and the probable future shifts in the landscape, notably around who owns the cars and where are they charged. Do people own their own cars so much, and are they therefore charged in the home, or are you more likely to rent your car when you need it and it comes from a central bank? And forecasting demand and where to put it, therefore, is clearly a very challenging piece. I think the only other thing I would mention in that space is, and again, it comes back to the innovation, is that there's talk, isn't there, of sacrificing the resilience in the electrical networks to provide that capacity. So the many areas with dual supply to provide that resilience and protection to consumers around their current electrical usage. Well, if you eat into that, you can obviously bring the capacity through for EVs, but you're going to sort of sacrifice that reliability and resilience within the system. But with battery technology galloping forward as fast as it is, are there other answers to that question? Do people simply buy a battery pack product for their backup power supply requirement that sits in the utility room or the garage and provides that for them? I think as those solutions come through, they're going to start to support the overall program and enable us to move forward faster and with confidence that we understand the solutions. Really briefly on procurement, I mean, I think, as is obvious from our conversation, there's going to be a range of opportunities in the market, from sort of turnkey, where clients are not interested, and I think someone else has said it, clients are not really interested in operating the assets and want to just outsource that responsibility, through to clients who are naturally asset managers and therefore see it as a welcome diversification and an additional revenue stream. So I think there'll be a range of those types of procurement opportunities in the market.
Thank you, Jason. And I have got one eye on the time, but there is an interesting question that has come through from Simon. I'd be interested to get Alex and Stephen's view on. Is just the extent of the coordination and discussions you're having with UKPN about reinforcing the network. So how do you find that interaction as you're going through huge rollout programs? Perhaps Alex, just starting with you, how do you find the utility service providers in the discussions with you?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I'll let Steve talk more technically around those aspects, but they're hugely important. I mean, hugely important. I mean, ultimately, EV charging is effectively, you know, a function of two things, which is land and power. Initially, I mean, that they are the fundamentals. If you're TfL, we have a huge amount of land, fantastic, but power obviously is still absolutely key. The future of DNOs, IDNOs, ICPs, etc., is hugely important to this. So far, all the discussions have been very positive. The solutions are out there. I think we're all pretty confident we can do that, but it needs some thinking, some holistic thinking around the future of hubs, if they are hubs, and obviously they'll demand the most power. As was noted, these are very power hungry, but that can be delivered with a range of technologies. Obviously, the use of renewables and storage, and the shifting and the methodologies that can play in around that. So there's a lot that can be done around that, and I'm pretty confident we'll solve the power issues. Where I suppose I'm excited by that is the creation of these hubs that factor in so many other areas. And forgive me, there's a couple of the questions that touched on the side of that, I think from Emily and John and others, sort of about the infrastructure, because it also plays into your question. For me, and of course it's a relatively personal view because none of us know the answer. The future is very much one that is polarized: residential charging and all the solutions that go with that, and then very high speed hubs. I'm not personally such a fan of workplace charging. For me, hubs will be the future. They are where people will go. A couple of the questions have touched on how this factors in with congestion, amount of cars in the overall park. That will come down. I mean, no one's saying cars will go up. The amount of cars will go down. It's how we maximize those through car sharing, which is another question, which has a huge role to play. So the hubs that TfL builds or has a role in facilitating will factor in all of this with rideshare, with all of the facilities, all of the amenities, the retail offer, everything that goes with that to maximize the user experience. There's loads more to say about that, but I won't for the interest of time. But that's sort of, a very quick snapshot of how I see the future of that rolling out.
And yeah, from a delivery and operational perspective, just with that perspective, through that lens, I think provided you engage early doors with the DNOs, I think they're generally sort of keen to assist. The issue with working with the DNOs is less about their ability to engage with you and support you. And and a lot of them have clear systems and procedures to follow, and that's quite straightforward. Where the challenge comes is actually managing the cost to an optimal level and accelerating delivery. And that's where, as you mentioned there, Alex, the role of ICPs can actually play an important part, where they can provide extra operational capacity into the DNO in effect on behalf of the client to accelerate that and overcome that DNO issue. So I don't see it as a major issue. Obviously at the macro level regarding the sort of national grid and resource and whatever, I don't really have a point of view on this webinar, but no, I don't really see a major challenge there, provided you have enough time and plan accordingly.
Thanks, Steve. And JP, I am quite keen to hear from your point of view as to how all of this will be regulated going forward. What's your view? It's one of the questions that has come through about how all of that will be stitched together.
Yeah, so I think we touched on some of this before. So obviously we got the regulations regarding new petrol and diesel cars, but the other side regulations, there's a lot of consumer type of protection regulations. So regulations regarding connection standards, charging, so charging in an open and non-discriminatory manner, method of payment, there's also regulations in that respect. And there's a consultation that's ongoing at the moment, actually, just taking that to another level, as it were. So again, concentrating on payment methods, because I think consumers are struggling, do I need to apply on this app? Do I need this card? And so I think they're trying to smooth that customer journey. There's also reliability standards. If if you're desperate to be charged and you go to a charging point and it's not working. So that's another element. And probably also accessibility for disabled customers and lighting. So all to do with safety and that side. So that's ongoing. And then the other area is looking at landlords. So this is new builds, so bringing in mandatory installation of charging points. So I think that's another thing, that's the road to zero strategy that's looking at that. And also street lighting. Any new street lights will potentially have charging points. So there's lots going on. And I think I think on the consumer side, that's generally, I think everyone can understand that and follow that, and I think that's going definitely the right way, as long as it's not restrictive. I think imposing obligations on new build and also the looking at existing build, I think, is a more difficult question. We've looked at that in other guises on renewables, for example, and carbon footprint. So there's always a question of who's going to pay for that, and some challenges in that respect.
Thank you, JP. And just looking at the time, we've got only 2 minutes left. I think safe to say this is a topic and a subject that we could continue discussing for a lot longer and over a number of other webinars. So I think we are just about out of time. So I would just like to thank you all to our panelists for their insightful views and comments this morning. And thank you to all of our guests as well, who have made the time to attend our webinar, and it's very much appreciated. But just before you go, please do visit our G&T Market Intelligence microsite if you would like to read more about the EV market and the publications that we have posted so far. Please do reach out to any of the experts on today's panels if you have any further specific questions. And I think, as I said at the start, we would be looking to come back to the questions that have been raised. And sorry if we didn't get to cover all of them in the detail that you have wanted, but thank you for raising those. We plan to have a next EV webinar on the 7th of July, and we'll be coming out to you all in terms of the content and the topic for the next event. So please do look out for that. And also would be very interested to hear feedback and survey after today. So please do let us know. And just like to say once again, thank you very much to you all, to our panelists and to our guests, and have a good Wednesday. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks all.